once again, good afternoon and welcome everybody to this, the latest in our 2022-2023 series of Planning Live webinars. My name is Elaine Farquharson-Black. I'm a partner in the Brody's planning team, and this afternoon I have been entrusted with chairing the conversation, and it's a first for me, so bear with me. Everyone who's tuned in before will be familiar with the format. It's an informal conversation, a chat about planning topics. And there's been a little bit of a theme, obviously, recently with NPF4 never being far from everybody's lips. And of course, the nature crisis is recognised in Policy 1 of NPF4. And then we've got Policy 3, which seeks to protect biodiversity, reverse biodiversity loss, deliver positive effects from development and strengthen nature networks. And we've got Nature Scott, who's prepared guidance on how developments might demonstrate biodiversity enhancement. It's clearly an area which is of interest to all sectors, as evidenced by the large number of people from a wide variety of sectors who've signed up for this afternoon's session. And so I'm delighted that we're being joined by Dr Caroline McParland. She's Technical Director of Ecology at WSP. And Caroline's going to be chatting to our very own Neil Collar about biodiversity issues. So, as I mentioned, Caroline's a Technical Director of Ecology at WSP, where she's a specialist in ecological impact assessment, providing guidance on ECIA for projects in the energy and transport sectors and carrying out habitats regulations assessments. She's also Vice President of the Chartered Institute of Ecology and Environmental Management and serves on the editorial board for their journal, which is called In Practice. With 20 years in consultancy and 5 years of academic experience, Caroline's career has included aquatic ecology research in Canada, protected species surveys across the UK, ECIAs for major transport schemes, environmental and ecology inputs on water resource, schools and hospital projects, review and coordination of EIAs for hydropower and other infrastructure projects in the UK and Europe, and consultancy work in New Zealand. So a huge wide range of experience and lots to talk about, and obviously a well-travelled and well-used passport as well, Caroline, so I'm quite jealous of that aspect. But as I say, lots to talk about. So at this point, I'm going to hand over to Neil and Caroline to have a chat about the key biodiversity issues.
Thanks very much, Elaine, and good afternoon, Caroline, and welcome to the audience. Those of you who've been on before will see that I've switched my background in favour of the biodiversity theme and gone from office buildings to actually a bit more of a rural scene, and some of you might recognise it, but that's a completely different story. Caroline, starting with just, I suppose, some basic contextualising. As Elaine said, the theme is biodiversity. She mentioned ecology. We also talk about nature conservation. Are these all the same thing? Are there differences? What do they kind of mean?
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, Elaine, for that introduction. That was great. Biodiversity, nature conservation, and ecology—they're all related terms, but a few sort of basic dictionary style definitions. So biodiversity is basically the variety of life on Earth. It's a short form of biological diversity, and that's defined by the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, as the variability amongst living organisms, including the diversity within species and between species and of ecosystems. And the word ecology is related to that. It was actually coined in the 19th century by the German zoologist Ernst Haeckel, and he applied the term ecology to the relationship between animals to its organic and its inorganic environment. So the physical environment plays a role here as well in ecology. And the word's coined from the Greek word oikos, which means household or home or place to live. So you could already see in the very definition of it the links to planning and to place. And the modern definition is generally ecology is the study of the interactions between living things and their environments. So it doesn't just include animals, it's microbes, it's plants, it's fungi. And all the interactions that they have between each other and between their physical environment. So their habitats, the geological environment, air, water, and so on and so forth. Nature conservation is the science and practice of protecting nature. There's a bit of a moral and philosophical element to that as well. And in essence, it includes protecting the physical environment as well as the biological one and the interactions between these. So nature conservation is about protecting biodiversity and ecology in essence. So there's a lot of different interactions there. And if you're putting that into the context of planning, we're really dealing with how development affects the ecology of biological life. So you take something like a road scheme or a rail scheme, that can cut through or fragment a woodland habitat. So it's already making a change in that physical environment and the biology of the woods themselves. And that habitat might be used by bats or red squirrels. And that'll change how they can use that environment and how they can move around it and interact with it. So you already begin to see how development can interact with biodiversity and with its own interactions within and amongst species as well. So that's the basic context there.
And I suppose an interesting thing I'm remembering in passing through all of that is it's not necessarily restricted to protected species, significant species. It's really everything almost.
It is, yeah, and a lot of species are protected not just because they are important or rare or particularly vulnerable, but often a lot of species that are specifically protected are the ones that we know about. So you'll see specific protections for things like otters or bats or breeding wild birds as well. They're the sort of big, obvious, more visible species, but there's an awful lot of species that are really important for biodiversity and for us as well. So a lot of pollinators, so pollinating insects and so on, and they're not as well known, not as well studied, but there's an awful lot of them. Tens upon thousands of species, many of which haven't even been documented yet as well. So it does cover all of biological life, including ourselves. Although we've rather, as we go through the conversation today, we might cover how we've sort of lost our understanding of that and are hopefully starting to regain it.
And I suppose it's picking up on that a bit. I was thinking it's that sort of Monty Python, Monty Python-esque. What has biodiversity ever done for us?
Yeah.
Why are we putting the emphasis on it, as Elaine mentioned?
So it's important because it provides the basis for everything we need for life. So food. I mean, that's obvious if you take things like food crops. Water as well, if you look at river systems and also the quality of that water. So the living things within a river system, like the vegetation and so on, have a role to play in managing water quality. That's important for us. Materials for clothing, shelter, and medicines, and some other services. So it can be important culturally as well. And those interactions, the ecology of those living things are really important for us directly. So take, for example, pollinating insects. That supports 84% of the crops in Europe. So you begin to see something very immediately, okay, if we don't have pollinators pollinating our crops, suddenly we're looking at the potential for major food shortages, and we're going a little bit beyond not having tomatoes in February, which was in the news a couple of months back. And to put a few more numbers on that, the value of nature to global GDP has been estimated by the World Economic Forum at $44 trillion. And more than half of global GDP is considered to be moderately or highly dependent on nature. Take the construction sector, we're looking at $4 trillion from direct resource extraction and in services that nature might provide. So flood attenuation from woodlands, healthy soils, clean air as well. So the right planting, particularly in urban areas, has beneficial effects on water quality. Carbon storage, we're all very focused on these days because of the climate emergency. And so if we lose biodiversity, we begin to lose some of these services that are called ecosystem services. And those interactions between living things and their environment disappear if that biodiversity disappears. So, you know, what's biodiversity done for us? Well, made life possible, basically. So hugely, hugely important. And it's, you know, it's refreshing to see how there is a realization of that by governments now, as well as by businesses and local communities, and not simply those working directly in the biodiversity and ecology space.
And when we were having a chat in preparation for this, I was asking you what the attitude in the developer community is now, because that's the theme we've seen. You know, for instance, with pre-application consultation, that initially there was a bit of defensiveness and skepticism, and then people get used to it and can see the value. Biodiversity, should we be seeing it as a constraint to development, you know, an awkward box to tick, a hurdle to clear, or is it really a necessity now for the reasons that we've been mentioning already?
Yeah, so I suppose it's not strictly a black and white constraint or necessity. There are times where we have to look at compliance with nature conservation legislation, and that's always focused on protection. So conserving species and sites for their own sake. So otters, as an example, in Scotland, they're a European protected species under the Conservation and Natural Habitats, etc. regulations 1994. The habitats regs, for less of a mouthful there. So if you have any activity that's got the potential to deliberately or recklessly kill, injure, harass them, or disturb them while they're occupying a place of shelter or looking after their young, or obstruct that access, or do anything that might change their local distribution, that activity has the potential to result in an offence under the habitats regulations. And so you might consider it a constraint because you have to then understand, say you're building a road that needs to cross a watercourse. Are there otters along there? That will require a qualified ecologist to go out and survey that area and advise the developer on whether or not you need a derogation license from NatureScot, in the case of Scotland, for that work to go ahead. And that'll require time and money and the right mitigation to be put in place, and a confidence that that mitigation will work. We might come on to the vagaries of dealing with wild animals later on, Neil. So you could view that as a constraint. Now, the flip side of that is there have been a few notable examples in the national press in the last year and a half or so of how not to do it. So if you're not engaging with these regulations and dealing with what might be seen as a constraint, there's a case in London a couple of years ago of a housing developer that was fined £600,000 for demolishing a bat roost. They knew the roost was there. It wasn't an especially important one, but it was there. They'd been given a planning condition to provide the right mitigation under license for removing that bat roost, but they went ahead and demolished the building anyway without doing any of that. I would have suggested that dropping a couple of zeros off that number might have been the better way to go, not to mention the time taken up through the judicial process as well. So when you look at, is biodiversity a constraint to development in that context? Well, actually, engaging early with ecologists and with the regulatory process is to the developer's advantage, purely from the point of view of avoiding lengthy legal processes and costly ones as well. Not to mention the reputational damage that comes from having yourselves plastered all over the likes of The Guardian for all to see. As an opportunity, well, if we look at some of the opportunities to engage with nature, we've already talked about the importance of biodiversity. We're also in a climate emergency as well. And the UK, and that includes Scotland, is one of the most nature depleted countries in the world. And there's an increasing recognition across businesses, communities, NGOs, and now governments that there are risks with continuing to deplete that biodiversity. So from that point, it becomes a necessity. And also, we can't really achieve net zero for the climate without working with nature. And that involves engaging with a set of solutions to adapting to climate change that are known as nature-based solutions. So they are actions that would help you protect and sustainably manage and restore natural systems or modified ecosystems that address changes in society and challenges in society. So things like food security. I mentioned the importance of pollinators to crops earlier, but also climate change and water security. For example, if you look at initiatives like the Clyde Climate Forest, which covers 8 council areas in the Greater Glasgow area, that's an initiative that's aimed at, firstly, carbon storage, but also connecting woodlands for their own sake, and also some of the societal issues such as lack of access to green space in deprived areas, lack of shading in extreme heat, which we're starting to see more of even this far north, and also issues like flooding.
In Glasgow?
Even in Glasgow, well, you know, Glasgow, Neil, if it's above 10 degrees, then, you know, it's tap-saff weather, as they say
Indeed.
here.
Yes.
Certainly last summer was pushing 30, even in Glasgow, which is hot for us, and was much worse south of the border. So there's lots of issues around that. And actually the Committee on Climate Change recommends that the UK's forestry cover needs to be up to 17% by 2050 as a specific means of tackling climate change. And there are targets for peatland restoration as well. And that's especially important in Scotland. The Scottish government's actually agreed to invest £250 million in restoring peatland between now and 2030. So that focuses us on the seriousness of the climate crisis and also the value that biodiversity can provide and the necessity of biodiversity. So there are risks to society from biodiversity loss. It's not a passive receptor of the things that we do to it. And if, for example, you clear trees away from urban areas, while we've all seen increases in forest fires all over the news, there have been peatland fires in Scotland, have very negative effects on air quality. But the value, to put a financial number on it, across the world's 10 megacities, according to the World Economic Forum, you're looking at the value in terms of pollution reduction of $482 million a year that can be set against the costs, both social and economic, of increases in hazardous air pollution levels. You think about the costs to healthcare systems of dealing with increased issues due to poor air quality. And again, you begin to see just what a necessity biodiversity is for us. So very long-winded answer to your initial question, but I'd say biodiversity is much more of a necessity than a constraint.
Okay, I'm going to maybe jump in here, Neil, with a question that we've got, which is about that balancing the conservation of biodiversity that you've talked about, and obviously the importance of that with the growing demands of, you know, kind of human development and resource consumption. And I suppose it's, you know, how can we do that balance?
I think we absolutely can. You know, one of the themes that you see in NPF4 is the concept of the 20-minute neighborhood. And that really speaks to the way in which we organize ourselves in communities to meet our own daily needs within 20 minutes. And that includes connection to other communities through sustainable transport linkages, of course. So it's not keeping everyone within 20 minutes of their home. So I think that's an important way to achieve that balance, because one of the things that we need in our communities, and that we know people want from research carried out by WSP and Bright Blue, is that people actually are supportive of requirements for developers to enhance the natural environment when they're building new houses. And they'd be more likely to support new infrastructure development as well if there was an obligation on utility companies, for example, to materially improve the local natural environment. So you can already see the balance that can potentially be achieved if we look at master planning, for example, for 20-minute neighborhoods. If we look at what people are actually asking for in their local communities from developers, suddenly it opens up a lot of possibilities around creating neighborhoods that are nature positive and that can provide some of that access to areas for exercise, that can provide a sense of well-being as well. We're increasingly seeing nature prescriptions coming through in the health service, for example, getting people out walking in a local park, for example. So there's, going back to that research by WSP and Bright Blue, nearly 3/4 of the people surveyed supported that requirement on house builders to enhance the natural environment, and a similar proportion for infrastructure companies. If people were given £1,000 to spend on improving the natural environment, more than half of them said that spend it locally. And of the three things people are most concerned about in terms of places to live, they're concerned about crime, litter, and also the proximity of things like public parks as a factor in what they consider as a desirable place to live.
I haven't looked at it yet, but we had the Planning Minister launching the consultation on the 20-minute neighbourhoods today.
Yes,
So we'll
it's just landed today.
What's said in there about nature and biodiversity.
Yeah, I'll absolutely be diving into that. But certainly 20-minute neighbourhoods, I would say, are a really important mechanism for just bringing biodiversity improvements and securing those positive effects in development, because people need housing, they need schools, they need shops, they need to be able to get from home to work to all of those other amenities. And in doing so, we need to be addressing the biodiversity and climate crisis. So it's not about stopping development per se, but doing development in a different way.
And can you maybe give us some practical examples of what developers could do? Because inevitably people tend to think of the big developments, a big housing development, kind of a big area of open space and planting, etc., etc. But what about more modest developments and more practical examples?
Yes, there's lots of different things you can do. You can do something really simple like putting some bark mulching around trees along the edge of a cycle path in your local area. And that some of the oils in that park deter some pests. So that's better than spraying lots of pesticides around. And it also keeps a bit of moisture in. So suddenly you've saved money on watering the trees and spraying pesticides. That's such a simple thing that actually you could do in your own garden and around your own neighborhood. And of course, the trees being retained or planted there as well provide a bit of shading. If you're cycling along a cycle path in high summer, you might get more than a bit hot and bothered. So again, that's another benefit of having the trees there. It's an additional service that the trees have provided, a bit of shade. And there's lots of off-the-shelf products as well that you can put into buildings. There are bat bricks and even bee bricks as well. So you can actually make space for them right into buildings. There are specialized curbstones as well that allow newts and frogs to pass safely around the back of gully pots, those drains along the edges of roads, so that they don't fall in. So there's lots and lots of really simple things that you can do. Drainage systems themselves can be made sustainably. So having some wetland planting to filter pollutants out of water. You've got your drainage. You've got an improvement in water quality as well, which can have downstream benefits for anyone using that water. It's less expensive for the water company to treat it in the first place, but also you're creating habitat for biodiversity. So that all speaks to the ability of biodiversity to interact with its environment against, going right back to ecology itself. And that can make, because of that ability of living systems to react to their environment, they can actually be much better tools if you're using these systems in nature-based solutions around developments than, say, simply putting a grey drainage system in. Okay, we need to drain this area, we need to drain this small housing development of 5 houses, needs some drainage. Well, we could put a grey drainage system in there, we could put pipework in there, and that would certainly do the job, but it wouldn't do all of those other things as well that are beneficial. So, grey infrastructure generally has one purpose, or one or two. When we get to green and blue infrastructure in a nature-based solutions approach, suddenly you've got several things going on at once.
And that's reminding me, I was having a wander through Glasgow University, the new part of the campus where the Western Infirmary used to be, and was admiring, there's a sort of open channel drainage system down towards the river, interspersed with paths, seating areas, and that looks very nature-based solution, to use your words, and actually a very attractive looking from a user perspective. Must actually go back and take a photo of it sometime.
Yeah, and that's the thing, people want these sorts of places. I was referring to our research with Bright Blue earlier, and people want to see this sort of thing in their neighborhoods. You've got somewhere pleasant to sit and have a rest if you're having a walk there with the benches. You've got the drainage. There's an improvement in well-being already. I mean, I worked on a hospital extension development some years ago, and the clinical director in that development actually recognized the benefits of retaining vegetation. The solution that we as the ecology team working on that development wanted also happened to work well for her in terms of the layout of the building and the extension. But she recognized that hospital patients can have faster and more effective recovery if they've got good green space. So similarly to your drainage example, there are health benefits from having that greenery around you.
And just kind of jumping in there, just a kind of question, and just really a confirmation probably, Caroline, that it applies to all developments. We've got somebody who's got, a client who's almost actively getting rid of, kind of those habitats, and that is part of the development. Actually, these requirements are not just, we often focus a lot on housing or that. This applies to all developments under NPF 4.
Yeah, so when you look at policy 3, which deals with the positive effects for biodiversity, and that's the main answer to the 6 outcomes of all developments in Scotland under the 2019 Planning Act. Outcome 6 is positive effects for biodiversity. It does apply to all developments. Now, policy 3 in NPF 4 says different things about different types of development. So if you look at policy 3A, that covers generally the points that you covered in your introduction around securing positive effects for biodiversity. 3B deals with national and major EIA developments and speaks to the need to protect, conserve and enhance biodiversity. And that includes nature networks. It's not simply individual species and habitats, but the networks between them. And it also deals with the need for those positive effects to be demonstrably shown as well. So your biodiversity needs to be shown to be better than it was before you started the development. There's similar requirements from local developments as well under policy 3C, where it's linked to that conservation, protection, making sure that it is, wherever possible, a positive effect on biodiversity. And there's guidance produced by Nature Scott that speaks to policy 3C as well. It's called the Developing with Nature Guidance. So it does apply to all developments, and there might be different levels of biodiversity protection required just in terms of complying with legislation, but also that securing positive effects for biodiversity does apply at all types of development.
And would apply also the kind of rural and urban because that's, you know, another question. It
Yes.
applies all types and in all locations. And then just a kind of question, just on still picking up on that from Alistair Hilton, Dundee City Council, talking about, you know, are there any drivers for a commercial developer to improve biodiversity, or is it all just about trying to navigate the way through NPF4? You know, are there other commercial benefits, I suppose, that we can point to?
There are commercial benefits, and certainly there's you know, an increasing awareness of the ability to you know, finance biodiversity or to try and monetize it as well. And that's not an area I'm an expert in. I've got colleagues who are experts in that. But for example, there are drivers such as the ability to offset and to provide enhancements off-site. You might there might be a commercial reason for providing some habitat banking. So if, for example, you can't physically on your site provide a positive benefit for biodiversity, then you might be able to do that elsewhere. And there are already organizations that are creating habitat banks, and it includes some of the NGOs as well. And there's a monetary value on that. But going back to you know, some of the positives as well in terms of commercial drivers, obviously people are, you know, willing to pay for biodiversity as well. That example I gave earlier about if people were given £1,000 to spend on nature, they'd spend it in their local community. And you've also got drivers coming from government as well. So the Peatland Action Fund and restoration from the Scottish Government, £250 million between now and the end of the decade is pretty significant, to say the very least. So there are funds available for restoring nature and for bringing nature into development as well. It's not, there's definitely an increase on the carrots as opposed to the sticks when it comes to biodiversity and development, for sure.
I'm going to go back to the sticks though, in terms of the rules, because before we finish up, we better just touch on the rules, particularly because there's an interesting divergence in approach in England, but not in Wales this time. I get very used to talking about England and Wales, which, being Scottish, I shouldn't, because probably the Welsh are annoyed about being bundled in with England all the time. But in England from November, but on a rolling basis, they're introducing a mandatory minimum 10%. I've done it again. I've put down the acronym and then your mind goes blank. BNG, biodiversity net gain.
That's right.
Come back to me. And they have a very complicated calculation system, which I don't want us to talk about. It's enough to know it's complicated. In contrast, as Elaine mentioned in the introduction, we've got a very broad brush approach in Scotland through NPF, the Nature Scot guidance, and it tends to focus much more on the overall objective rather than being too prescriptive on the approach. But we know from other examples that in some ways flexibility is good, but the problem with flexibility is there's also uncertainty. So that's a very kind of detailed run up to, do you find the lack of rules in Scotland as a problem? Are you picking up from practice in England that the numeric sort of approach is better or has disadvantages?
Yeah, so I mean, we could be here for days, couldn't we? Just on this this particular subject alone, couldn't we, Neil? But you know, to get back to the basics of this, it's really whether you've got a broad brush approach or a very numerical approach, you've got to always remember your objectives. We need to start to restore nature if we're going to address the risks that we as a society face due to biodiversity loss. So all of those things that we were talking about at the start of the conversation. And simply mitigating the negative effects isn't enough anymore. We need to start to reverse all of that. We've got the most up-to-date data from Scotland is that there is an overall net loss. We're looking at 49% of species in Scotland have actually declined in abundance since 1970. It's a pretty shocking figure, and that's just one stat I could give you. 11% of species in Scotland are threatened with extinction at this point in time. So we need to make gains. How we go about doing that? Well, there's the advantages of having specific targets in a metric is certainty, as you mentioned. And that is important for local authorities. They need certainty and clarity so that they can be clear about what advice they're given to planning applicants. And certainly that's some of the feedback I've heard from local authorities across Scotland, is that they do want more certainty rather than flexibility. Not that they want to simply be told rigidly what to do, but they do value that certainty. And applicants need to know if they've got their application right first time as well. When I was working in New Zealand, at that time, they didn't have a standard set of ecological impact assessment guidance. And, I was involved in them getting started on that. And some of the feedback we got at that time was that people needed certainty, or they needed clarity about what was considered appropriate to do when dealing with biodiversity and development. Same sort of idea here. The other thing is we need to know if we're making progress against any of the targets that we set for ourselves as developers and planners. How do we know that we're going to meet our commitments to net zero by 2045? We've touched on how nature can play a role in that in terms of things like trees or peatlands storing carbon. So how do we know we're actually getting where we need to go without measuring that in some way? And that's the benefit of having a metric type approach. Now, it is easy to fall into the trap of playing a numbers game, of course, with metrics and forgetting your overall objective, which is to secure positive effects for biodiversity. And I think it's really important to remember that metrics are tools, just like mitigation techniques or nature positive design in a development. It's all part of our overall toolkit. And you also got to remember that you can't do things like replace the irreplaceable, no matter what metric you use. So if you remove ancient woodland, that's it, it's gone. The basic definition of anything that was continuously wooded since 1760 in Scotland, if you take that away, well, you're not going to get that back on the time scale of any development. Housing development these days, the buildings are guaranteed for something like 10 years. There's no way you can replace any ancient woodland in that situation. And that irreplaceability is recognised in other parts of NPF4 as well. You also have to replace like for like. So you need a qualified ecologist helping you interpret metrics. So I think metrics, rules, general targets, they give us some certainty, but we've got to treat them as tools rather than the means themselves, if that makes sense.
Definitely. You mentioned there local authorities, and there's always a concern around sufficiency of expertise and resources. In relation to biodiversity, in your experience, are local authorities well placed, or is this all going to be a struggle for them because they just don't have enough resources and the right resource?
That just actually, Caroline, just before you answer that picks up actually, one of the kind of questions that come in is, who arbitrates in the matter of appropriateness of ecology decisions, and, the unintended consequences of some rewilding or reintroducing, absent species. So it's kind of similar in terms of who's got that expertise.
Yeah, so actually, Saim last year held some workshops as NPF4 was still in draft, covering policy 3. And out of that, we carried out a survey, and, many local authorities in Scotland don't have the capacity or feel that they have the capacity to deal with biodiversity. there are opportunities, of course, for bodies like SLAIM to provide training, and that's something that we're doing. But also, it's making sure that you do engage a suitably qualified ecologist for any of your biodiversity needs, so that at least you know that you're doing the right thing. You've got the right information about what biodiversity you have now. You've got robust and defensible mitigation and enhancement plans as well. And I'd say in terms of arbitration, early engagement with bodies like NatureScot and other organisations that have a role to play in biodiversity, so SEPA, and also the councils themselves, they've all got biodiversity action plans. Engaging with all of those groups is really important. It's also worth engaging with some of the NGOs who can provide lots and lots of data and context and expertise as well. So there are lots of sources of expertise, but they're certainly not necessarily held within councils either exclusively or in some cases at all. And I know councils in Scotland certainly feel that lack, is that they are worried about the lack of training and capacity that they have to deal with what is a really complex area. You sort of introduced me at the start. I started out as an aquatic ecologist. I've done other things. I've got colleagues who know things about bats that I would never even have thought of, So I have to rely as an ecologist on other ecologists and other specialists as well. And councils have to do that as well. I mean, in terms of unintended consequences of reintroductions and rewilding, I mean, what we've seen, if anybody watches Scottish Parliament TV, I do sometimes. It's not as dull as you think, but there was a really well-balanced and informed debate last week on reintroduction of the lynx to Scotland. And one of the big pieces about that was engaging society. Where reintroductions have failed, and it was proposed for the Kielder Forest area in England a few years ago, and that failed largely on the basis that the communities hadn't been engaged and their concerns weren't discussed or addressed in any way. And Natural England rejected that application for reintroduction. So I think in terms of arbitrating unintended consequences, you've got to bring people along with you and make sure that you have considered all the possibilities. That even applies to things like mitigation. If you're going to move a population of newts from a site and put them somewhere else, you need to make sure that you're not introducing disease to another population of newts, that you're not bringing those newts into a place where they're not going to survive. It's why translocation and reintroduction is often considered a last resort. When you look at species reintroductions and rewildings now, and you look at it in the context of the biodiversity emergency, we're at the last resort stage.
I'm conscious of the time, but I'm enjoying this too much, Neil. So I'm going to give you one last kind of topic to discuss, and then we're going to wind it up. And the questions have been coming in kind of thick and fast, and we'll pick up some of those kind of offline after at the end. But one last topic, Neil, to have a wee chat on.
Thank you. You've got to tell us the badger story.
The badger story. Oh yeah. So I mean, I've got numerous badger stories, but not too long ago, a client said to me, "Oh, it's up to the badgers now, isn't it?" And the context of that was that we'd spent actually a couple of years mapping badger territories for this site. We knew quite early on that we had to destroy a main badger set, and we had to make provision for the badgers elsewhere by creating an artificial set. So first of all, we had to figure out where those badgers were moving across the landscape, where other badger clans were, because we didn't want to start a badger fight by moving our badgers away. And also we had to make sure that we provided and demonstrated some use of, or at least awareness of, an artificial set that we created for them. And so we went through that 2-year process and got to the point of the artificial set being all ready. We'd put food out for the badgers to encourage them. What the badgers actually did was, there was another set called an annex set off in the woods. They decided to just expand that instead. And they were sort of interested in the set we'd made them, but they preferred their other set. So it didn't quite go according to plan, but we did meet the overall objective of making sure that they had a replacement for what we were taking from them. They're not always that cooperative, though. I did have another colleague try and move badgers on from an old coal mine once, which had to be closed because it was seeping into a drinking water reservoir. And she'd gone through the process of creating an artificial set, trying to exclude the badgers from the old set that had to be closed. And that closure process is a 21-day process to make sure the badgers have definitely gone. Well, on day 19, they broke back into their old set, which of course had a knock-on effect on the whole construction program and the need to get the badgers out of there before their breeding season kicked in at the start of December as well, because you wouldn't be able to move them after that point. So it's the joys of dealing with wild animals. You can come up with a brilliant mitigation plan and you can even implement it. But as my client said to me, it's up to the badgers now.
It's like they say on TV, isn't it? Never work with children or animals.
Yeah,
that's the problem.
yeah,
well,
absolutely.
As they're kind of conscious of the time, so thank you, Caroline, and thank you, Neil. We've covered a wide range, and it is fascinating. I love the nature prescription. I've got to go and pick up my migraine, kind of prescription. So I think the nature prescription, I do my best thinking when I'm out in the woods. And Franklin Roosevelt said, that a nation that destroys its soils destroys itself, which is a bit like what you said there. You lose biodiversity, you lose, life itself, and some of those things that you said we can all do. The kind of even that's mulch, at the edge of paths and things that we can all do in our gardens. So, so that's great. Thank you so much, for sharing your knowledge with us. And so that kind of drawing this one to an end. And before we go, a reminder that our next Planning Live is going to be on Thursday, the 25th of May. The details are on the screen at the moment. That's going to be on local place plans with Nick Wright and Joanna Boynd. And you can sign up for that now or watch out. We'll be putting out on social media the kind of details of it. But that just leaves me to once again thank Caroline and thank Neil, and thank you all for joining us, and have a nice evening.
Okay. Thanks, everyone.